Right, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I can't pretend that I'm going to be dealing with nitty-gritty politics like the universal credit, but I think I'm going to say something which it gives you a kind of historical context in which to deal with these contemporary issues. The whole business of giving. When I give a gift, I give a part of myself. Those are the words of the father of anthropology, Marcel Mauss, and he was suggesting that all gifts in some way involve sacrifice on the part of the giver. But in fact, that's only true in some circumstances. Over the past 6 years, in researching my book, Philanthropy, from Aristotle to Zuckerberg, I've come to realize there are in fact two distinct traditions in philanthropy, and they emerged very early on. And one dominated charitable giving for 1,000 years, and then there was a dramatic shift, and the other tradition gained the ascendancy, and it's still in the ascendant today. And that is the kind of giving which doesn't involve sacrifice. So what my book argues is that to make philanthropy better in today's world, we need to restore the balance between these two traditions. And the issue goes to the heart of the relationship between charity, justice, and giving. So the book's called Philanthropy from Aristotle to Zuckerberg, but the word philanthropy has its origins a couple of hundred years before Aristotle. It first appears 2,500 years ago as an adjective in Aeschylus's play Prometheus Bound, where it is actually a term of abuse. Now, I'm trying to make my slides work here. Well, there we are. It does work. So you can see with a little red arrow there, it's on line 11. This is a digitized manuscript from the British Library, which staged a digitized exhibition of its original manuscripts, which are featured in my book. And Prometheus, the benevolent god who shared divine fire with mortals, and in doing so incurred the wrath of the other gods, Zeus, they declare, here we see in Aeschylus, this action to be human-loving. It's a treacherous action to be human-loving. Philos, and then anthropos. I'm just having a problem with my slide here. There we are. It is, anthropos means a human being, philos means love of humanity. So, as Prometheus found, being chained to a rock and having his liver eaten out every day, philanthropy was a controversial business right from the outset. So it's first used as a noun in the way we would understand it by Socrates in the Euthyphro. Plato records the master as saying that he educated others without charge out of philanthropia, friendship for humankind. And again, the double-edged sword of philanthropy, the double edge of philanthropy is evident because philanthropy led to the death of Socrates because his fellow Athenians accused his gift of free education of corrupting the youth of the city. So the use of the word philanthropy in its modern sense begins with this man, Aristotle. He insisted that giving was about improving the moral character of the giver. Now, in the general culture around him, it was a lot less high-minded. In the heyday of Athenian democracy, they had a system known as liturgia, which interestingly is where we get our word liturgy. And this was used to persuade members of the wealthy elite to choose to finance some public cause out of their own pocket, funding a play, sending a team to the Olympic Games, building a temple, or even a warship. And the prominent citizens sought to outdo one another in the extravagance of their gifts to show the superiority of their own civic virtue. And so from the outset, philanthropy in this tradition was about power and prestige, and it was lavished according to the personal preferences of the donors. The Romans were in the same tradition. They saw philanthropy as a political investment to buy the favor of the masses by distributing salt, olive oil, paying barbers to give free haircuts to the plebeians, building baths, aqueducts, temples, and roads. And they had their names inscribed, the donors, on the buildings with this legend here, De sua pecuna fecit, which means built with his own money. So there's a boastfulness about philanthropy, and a place. It's about cementing your place in society. In the Greco-Roman world, philanthropy is, yes, says Aristotle, about developing the good character of the donor, but it's also about honor and prestige and status and reputation, and about maintaining the social order. And there's one key thing it's not about. It's not about kindness or a duty of common humanity. It's not about the recipients. It's about the rich rather than the poor. Now, long before Socrates was born, a significant development had taken place among the people who lived 40 days' journey to the east in Israel, towards the end of the Iron Age, 10 centuries before Christ. One of the Canaanite groups underwent a shift in its religion from worshipping many gods to worshipping just one. And this story, the story of the worship of the one God, is embodied in the figure of Abraham, who was called by God to be the father of three great faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And this new monotheism was to have a profound impact on the history of philanthropy. Because Judaism brought a revolution to philanthropy. From its very first text, the book of Genesis, which told the story of Adam and Eve, it declared that every man and woman was made in the image of God. And this was a revolutionary doctrine in a Middle Eastern world where only kings and emperors and pharaohs could be gods. Here we are, as you see in this illustration from a Vulgate Bible. There's not much difference physically between God and his creation. Only the clothes give the distinction away. But something else was new. Judaism saw this one God as the epitome of generosity. Yahweh was spoken of as the God of the poor, and that was a phrase which never was applied to any Greek or Roman god. The stranger, the widow, the orphan were repeatedly singled out as being deserving of charity, and God had a special love for the poor, and therefore so should all believers. So, in contrast to the Greco-Roman view of the world, giving is no longer simply about a social relationship. For the Jews, it's a human echo of God's generosity towards humankind. And it injected into philanthropy the idea that both those who gave and those who received were bound together in a relationship with one another, and with God, and with the entire community. And later, the Jewish sage Maimonides codified giving into a ladder with 8 stages of ascending merit, and the highest of these was helping others towards self-sufficiency. The God of the Torah is more than the epitome of generosity. In Hebrew, the word for charity, tzedakah, is also the word for justice. One word for charity and justice. The one God is a God of charity, justice, and righteous judgment. And all of those qualities were necessary to maintain social harmony, which is why the Jewish word for peace, shalom, means far more than the absence of conflict. Shalom encompasses health, well-being, prosperity, and justice. Judaism sets out to create a community in which the fortunate and the less fortunate can live in harmony together. So, to sum up this stage, for the Greeks and the Romans, philanthropy is about cementing society. It's top-down, and it's always a voluntary activity among the elite. By contrast, for the Jews, tzedakah is about community. It's two-way, and it's a religious obligation which falls on everybody. Even the poor have the obligation of charity and justice. So these two philanthropic traditions, the Greek and the Hebrew, the top-down and the two-way, have dominated philanthropy for 2,000 years. And they persist today in what in the book I call strategic philanthropy and reciprocal philanthropy. And we'll come on to this. Now, there have been attempts to bring these two traditions together. And one of these was a book which we don't really know much now, but which in the early years of Christianity was accorded the same kind of status as the Gospels. The Shepherd of Hermos was written about 150 AD, and it insisted that the rich must minister to widows, orphans, and the destitute. And the poor must pray to God on behalf of the rich, because God more readily hears the intercessions of a poor man or woman. And thus, says Hermos, rich and poor become bound together in a symbiotic relationship, what Hermos describes as being, quote, like a barren elm tree around which is entwined a fruitful vine. Ambrose, who was the Bishop of Milan in 386 AD, wrote the first great work on Christian philanthropy, and it set out to synthesize the Roman Stoic principles and this Jewish vision of charity. But it was the Jewish tradition of social justice and two-way philanthropy which came to dominate Christianity for 1,000 years. Next slide is of Basil of Caesarea. He was a rich man. He spent his own fortune to relieve a terrible famine in his homeland in the 4th century. And he insisted that giving was no longer merely a matter of honor or status or civic duty. It wasn't even an emulation of God's generosity. It was a matter of justice. And that idea was enshrined 600 years later in the work of Gratian, a monk from Bologna, who around 1140 created a great systematization of the Christian inheritance, and it brought together the teachings of Clement and Basil and Ambrose and the church fathers and the canons of the great church councils and the decrees of the popes across 1,000 years in this great synthesis. And justice in wealth was really key to it. This is Gratian's manuscript, and this is a teaching which at this high point of Christendom no one is exempt from. This was the time of feudal society when serfs and peasants were trapped in lives of economic hardship, but religion created a kind of spiritual bond between giver and receiver, which medieval theologians spoke of as the doctrine of the mystical body. And this held that all believers, whether rich or poor, were connected in some kind of cosmic way to God and to one another. Now, you might think this is some kind of romantic, pious theory, but kings and bishops were united by that vision, and they put it into practice. Next slide here is of Louis IX of France. Now, as late as the 13th century, here's a king who is personally still washing the feet of the poor. 3 centuries later, after the Reformation, Protestant propagandists began to claim that medieval charity had been haphazard, and this high theology was rarely put into practice. But modern scholarship shows that this clearly is not the case. So for about 1,000 years, from the 4th to the 14th centuries, giving was extensive throughout Europe. It was motivated by a shared Christian faith. It was institutionalized by the church through a system of tithes. Parishes distributed alms. Monasteries offered hospitality for travelers and nursed the sick and cared for widows, orphans, and the destitute. Medieval charity was also implemented through guilds, confraternities, almshouses, hostels, and hospitals, casual begging to casual giving to beggars, and then substantial donations and bequests later on by the growing merchant classes. So practical philanthropy was extensive throughout the Middle Ages. What changed all that was the Black Death. During the Great Bubonic pandemic of 1347 to 1351, somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of Europe was wiped out. And this illustration here shows pious sects whipping themselves in the streets to ask God to end the plague. And interesting, after the pandemic, many of these flagellants turned into cults of philanthropy. But that wasn't the major philanthropic consequence of the plague, because what happened was, after the Black Death, the economy of Europe underwent a radical shift. With fewer people to farm the land was abandoned, serfs and villeins went on the move in search of work or food. The nobility enclosed more land for profitable sheep grazing, and that forced more serfs from their home areas. It was the beginning of the end for feudalism, because at the same time, trade was increasing, towns were growing in size, a new merchant class was arising, and the economy became monetarized. So it was like the first stirrings of capitalism. And this changed philanthropy too. Because control of charity began to pass from the church to these burgeoning middle classes who now controlled the towns, which were the centres of the new economic activity. In Florence, a rich silk merchant, Felice Brancacci, commissioned these frescoes in his family chapel. And interestingly, they show 15th century Italian merchants in the dress of the time with the apostles distributing alms. The laity, rather than the clergy, were now in charge. And another consequence of the movement of people after the Black Death was that a tide of vagrant beggars swept the continent. And this provoked the rich to develop a much more hostile attitude towards the poor. This is the frontispiece of a book by an Elizabethan country magistrate named Thomas Harmon. As you'll see, it has the evocative title, A Caveat or Warning for Common Cursetors, vulgarly called Vagabonds. And the picture there shows a convicted beggar being tied to a cart and whipped through the streets. And the book is a taxonomy of 24 classes of categories of rogues, vagabonds, fraudsters, and others in Elizabethan society. Hang on, I just got something on my screen there. I should have got rid of that ages ago. So what was happening in this period was a shift from the Jewish to the Greek dominant model of philanthropy was underway. And a new idea arose with this growth of the begging classes and the vagrants, that the poor were in some way to blame for their own poverty. And as we all know, that is not an idea which society has fully shaken off. That notion was to shape philanthropy for the next 6 centuries. It was there in the Elizabethan Poor Laws. It was central to Victorian charitable moralizing, and it was implicit in the innate superiority of Andrew Carnegie, the man who we'll come on to see shaped 20th century philanthropy and still really shapes a lot of it today, in the kind of top-down approach of some philanthropists today. Now, the Victorian era, which is often seen as the high point of English philanthropy, vividly illustrates the tensions between these two traditions of philanthropy. On the one hand, we have this woman, Angela Burdett Coutts, perhaps the greatest of the Victorian philanthropists. She inherited a huge banking fortune, the Coutts Bank. She donated the enormous sum of £250,000 in those days to buy seed potatoes to send to Ireland during the Great Famine of the 1880s. She sent aid to Aboriginal peoples in Australia and Borneo. She commissioned an engineer to devise a machine which could dry 1,000 articles of linen in less than half an hour and sent it out to Florence Nightingale for the damp hospitals of the Crimea. She even provided drinking fountains for dogs. And under the influence of the novelist Charles Dickens, she began to spend her great inheritance on those at the bottom of the social heap: prostitutes, paupers, flower girls, chimney sweep boys. Here we see one of the many letters which Dickens wrote to her, reporting on his research trips for his novel writing, trips amongst the real poor of industrial society. And so extensive and omnivorous was her giving that she became known as the Queen of the Poor, and Cockneys took her name, Burdett Coutts, as rhyming slang for boots. She appeared on cigarette cards, as we saw in that last photograph. And when she died, at her funeral, the elegy was delivered by no less a person than the King, Edward VII. But the other tradition of philanthropy, that of philanthropy as social control, was also embodied in this Victorian era. And the most powerful philanthropic institution was something known as the Charity Organisation Society, the COS. It was aimed at the moral reform of the poor and a scientific philanthropy to prevent cunning, able-bodied paupers exploiting charities. Sound familiar? The critics said COS stood actually for Cringe or Starve. And what you see on this picture here is a mock application submitted to the COS seeking assistance for an itinerant preacher named Jesus Christ, who the application says tramped about with a number of low fellows who sometimes did odd jobs, fishing and the like. This was put in by a social activist curate in the East End of London, and this is the fictitious spoof reply from the COS that the curate had drafted. Jesus was refused assistance by the COS and rebuked for his want of thrift, his industry, temperance, and for the bad company he kept. They offered him a set of carpenter's tools if he would return to carpentry, but they refused to do anything else for him except recommend him to go to the infirmary, the lunatic department, or else to live a more businesslike and practical life. Now, of these two approaches, it was the top-down philanthropy, the philanthropy as social control, which was to triumph. And its great consolidation came when Andrew Carnegie became the richest man in the world. Whoops, what's gone here? Here we are. Yep, Andrew Carnegie. In 1901, this was. And he turned from being a steel magnate to being a full-time philanthropist. He was a follower of this man, Herbert Spencer, who is he's not much known now, but he was one of the prime philosophers of the English Victorian era. And Spencer was interesting because he applied Darwin's theory of evolution to human beings. And it was Spencer, not Darwin, who invented the phrase survival of the fittest. And the new super rich like Carnegie took this to mean that bosses were innately superior human beings. Obviously, they'd made all this money. And so they were better suited than their workers to deciding how money should be spent. If you gave money to the poor, they will just waste it on drink, said Carnegie. And when Spencer, the inventor of this social Darwinism, as it was called, visited New York, he was feted by Carnegie and his fellows with a lavish dinner at the city's top restaurant, Delmonico's. And the menu from that dinner survives, and I've got a copy of it in my book. And as you can see, it's got rich gravy stains on the side. It had no fewer than 25 courses of food, a dozen different kinds of wine. And in return for this hospitality, Spencer told the portly assembly of millionaires that their nation would eventually produce, quote, a more powerful type of man than has hitherto existed. I don't think he meant Donald Trump. Carnegie was one of the biggest philanthropists of this gilded age of philanthropy, and his giving was on an unprecedented scale. He built 3,000 libraries all around the world, parks, art galleries, museums, concert halls, and that inspired laudatory cartoons like this one. But he was also a man of political friendships, manipulating government tariffs, ruthless mergers and acquisitions, and ruthless behavior towards his workers whose wages he cut. And he equally inspired cartoons like this one. This shows him giving out money with one hand, which he has taken from the workers with the other. At one point, he even, to break a strike, brought in a private army, which killed a number of workmen. So Carnegie was this model of the big giver, but not just a big giver. He changed the whole template for philanthropy because it was no longer directed to the poor, but to the social infrastructure of culture and the arts. He made philanthropy more businesslike in its methods. He established the first philanthropic foundation. And he had the philosophy that he who dies rich dies disgraced. And that inspired later generations of mega givers like Bill Gates to sign the giving pledge, which means that they undertake to give away at least half of their fortune before they die. So in the modern world, philanthropy is on an epic scale. The wealth and the drive and the business acumen that people like Bill Gates has brought has brought huge benefits for humankind. That is undoubted. Polio once paralyzed 1,000 children every day, but cases have been cut worldwide by 99.9% thanks to the 2.5 billion vaccinations funded by Gates, who's seen in this picture, excuse me, administering a polio vaccine to a child in India. And in India, they've now declared polio eradicated. And just today, another massive breakthrough has been announced, a vaccine against malaria, which is one of the biggest scourges on humanity for millennia, and it kills mostly babies in Africa. Last year, 250,000 children died from malaria in Africa alone. And Gates gave more than $250 million to the pharmaceutical giant GSK to develop this vaccine, which is being launched today. So, great benefits from philanthrocapitalism. Gates is the great exemplar of this new philanthrocapitalism. It's rooted in a philosophy called effective altruism, which seeks to apply business methods to the charitable sector. Effective altruism says you can measure good by data, a very dubious concept, but it's key to Gates's approach. And the Gates Foundation now has a budget which is bigger than 70% of the world's nations. It spends more annually on health than the government of Germany does. So he's now not just doing vaccines and things, he's spending that on that scale on maternal and child health, family planning, nutrition, agriculture, financial services, clean water, sanitation. The role of philanthropy, private philanthropy in international life has increased dramatically over the past 2 decades. There are now 250,000 philanthropy foundations, and 75% of them have been set up in the last 20 years. And between them, they control more than $1.5 trillion. So the successes of philanthrocapitalism are clear, but it has a downside too. Gates spent, for example, $2 billion on nearly 3,000 high schools in America, serving nearly 1 million poor ethnic minority students. But a few years into the project, Gates suddenly decided it wasn't working and the approach was misconceived. And he abruptly ended the funding before many schools had been given the chance to demonstrate whether or not they could improve. To the philanthropist, it was a failed experiment and a few lost billions. To the children, it was years of jeopardized, if not lost, education. And Gates has been open to many of the same criticisms in his health work in the developing world. But one of the great things about Gates and the Gates Foundation is that it has gone on a steep learning curve in the process of the decades in which it's been active, and much of that has been thanks to Bill's ex-wife, Melinda Gates. She's still very much an equal partner in the Gates Foundation, and let's hope she stays so. Because while her ex-husband takes a data-led approach, her attitude is much more people-orientated, and she's taught him that great technical solutions are no good if you can't persuade people on the ground to buy into them. So, if many of today's big givers follow the top-down philosophy of Carnegie, the philanthropists know best their approach, which Gates embodies, although Melinda has softened extensively. There is another approach to philanthropy, which is much more rooted in the Jewish and the Christendom model of there being a relationship of mutual respect between the giver and the receiver. And perhaps the most graphic example of this in today's world is that of Mackenzie Scott. She was married to the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world. And when they divorced, she was allocated a 4% stake in Amazon. 4% has netted her around $60 billion. And it makes her about the 4th richest woman in the world. And in stark contrast to her former husband, who, despite being the richest man in the world, was known in the world of philanthropy as an extremely paltry giver, Mackenzie Scott immediately signed the giving pledge, the commitment to give away at least half of the money to charity before she dies. And she's not, as many of these philanthropists do, waiting till a deathbed dispensation of that. She's already given away $8.6 billion of it, and that's just in over a year. That's billion, not million. And what media commentators have noted the causes to which she's given. And they marked her out as a liberal progressive because of her funding of racial equality, LGBTQ plus groups, organizations to promote greater democracy and transparency, and groups dedicated to action on climate change. But to anyone with an interest in philanthropy and its relationship to charity and justice, what's really interesting is the way that she's been giving out her money. She got a small team of advisors together and asked them to identify, this is the quote she says, identify organizations with strong leadership teams and results, with a special attention to those operating in communities facing high projected food insecurity, high measures of racial inequity, high local poverty rates, and low access to philanthropic character. So the first thing to note about that is she's giving to areas which are traditionally neglected by philanthropists. We have this popular idea that philanthropy involves the transfer of money from the rich to the poor, but the figures show that about 80% of philanthropy goes to elite institutions, top universities, schools where the philanthropists went, opera houses, art galleries, which they frequent, the hospitals, medical research projects working in areas in which the rich individuals have a particular interest. By contrast, Mackenzie Scott has given huge amounts to organizations involved in food banks, delivering meals to those in need during the COVID crisis. She donated to something called Give Directly, which is a charity that gives people cash with no strings attached. And that dramatically expanded its operation this year to help people deal with the COVID crisis. And the funding from her was extensive. Last year, after the murder of George Floyd, when she announced a tranche of donations worth $1.7 billion, the largest part of that tranche, almost $600 million, went to racial equity groups. She gave to universities with historically heavy black representation, those serving the Hispanic community. She gave to women-led organizations, black women-led organizations, which tend to be at the very bottom of the pile for mainstream philanthropists. But the second thing about Mackenzie Scott's giving is that, as she says, she gives to organizations with strong leadership teams and results. What that means is she's not deciding from on high what are the solutions to the problems of the poor or the alienated or the marginalized, the people Pope Francis would say live on the peripheries. Rather, she is identifying key individuals and groups who appear to be effective in working in these areas. And she's saying to them, here's the money, you decide how to spend it. The organizations didn't have to apply for the money as they normally have to do with philanthropists. One of them put it was just a gift that fell from the sky. And while it's common for philanthropists to give grants that are restricted for a particular purpose and paid out over the course of several years or conditional on various benchmarks for success, she did none of that. She wrote when she announced the first giving, she said, I gave each a contribution and encouraged them to spend it on whatever they believe best serves their efforts. Unless organization leadership requested otherwise, all communities were paid upfront and left unrestricted to provide them with maximum flexibility. We believe that teams with experience on the front lines of challenges will know best how to put the money to good use. And this is in complete contrast to this command and control helicopter down method of the classic philanthrocapitalist. One of the people who received the money said, I never in my career have experienced a gift like this. So Scott doesn't, like her many philanthropists, trumpet her intentions in advance, and then often they drag their feet about stumping up the cash. She made her announcement after she'd given each tranche of money. And the New York Times said, in the course of a few months, Miss Scott has turned traditional philanthropy on its head. Now, the newspaper was talking about the fact that she was giving to different kinds of causes. She hadn't got a permanent charity. She hadn't got fancy headquarters or a huge staff. But the real revolution of Mackenzie Scott is that she has gone back to this original model of reciprocal philanthropy formed in that Jewish tradition, institutionalized in early Christianity, a model which in which the giver demonstrates a humility, recognizes the mutual humanity of the person to whom they give, and trusts them to know how best to spend the money which is given. It's reciprocal rather than strategic philanthropy, although it's very strategic in its own way. And it's a philanthropy which brings together charity and justice. Thanks very much.